Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 2, The 7 Islands of Bombay. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last time, we welcomed Charles Stuart back to London as King of England, Ireland and Scotland. We briefly covered all the massive changes which followed and how the Restoration left a lot of people, royalists and parliamentarians, disappointed. Today, we're going to look beyond the shores of Britain and Ireland, because the English Empire beckons. 1660 was actually one of my possible starting dates for the podcast because of how important the later Stuart period is to the British Empire's formation and growth. Charles returned to England in a much stronger international position than the realms of his father or grandfather. Remember the Battle of the Downs in 1639 between the Spanish and the Dutch? The Royal Navy, funded by ship money, had sat powerlessly by as the Dutch flouted English territorial waters. 2 decades later, the States Navy was once again the Royal Navy, and it had not only swollen in size, but been better organised and was now commanded by officers and crew who had defeated the Dutch in multiple battles. The army was also huge, although this was more of a political and financial burden. It will be gradually reduced as soldiers of the Republic are paid off and disbanded over the first year of Charles's return. This is all to say that a marriage alliance between the newly crowned King of England would be quite an advantage to the crowned heads of Europe. As we left off last time, the restored Charles II had his crowns, but he was missing something very important for the survival of the Stuart dynasty: an heir. Now, he did have children, at least 4 of them surviving childhood, 2 acknowledged sons and 2 daughters, but they were illegitimate, bastards, born out of the then-prince's relationships with various women during his exile. His firstborn, James Scott, was born in 1649 to Charles's first love, Lucy Walter. Now, Walter would claim that the 2 of them had been secretly married, and once he's older, James Scott will claim he has evidence to prove it, but he never provided it. Charles would always maintain that he never wed Lucy Walter, or the mothers of any of his illegitimate children, of which he would have 14 by the time of his death. A merry monarch indeed. But the king had to marry someone, and so the newly restored court cast about for a royal bride. Spain and France were both very keen on an alliance, not just to win Charles as a friend, but also to deny him to the other. Their war had only just ended, but the Franco-Spanish rivalry will be a staple of European politics for some time to come. Spain also wanted something in return for the years they had supported the exiled court and the royalist cause. And in 1660, they did get an armistice to end the war started by Cromwell in 1654. But that was the high point of relations, because the Spanish ambassador was being really annoying. He kept reminding Charles that he had promised to return Spanish territory stolen by the heretic revolutionaries. This was primarily the island of Jamaica and the port of Dunkirk. And that had been a promise that Charles had been more than willing to make when those heretic revolutionaries had been in control. But since then, he'd been restored to his thrones without Spain's help. And now he was back in London, and Jamaica and Dunkirk answered to him. And, well, Charles would quite like to keep them, actually. So he formally renounced his previous promise and told Parliament to annex both Jamaica and Dunkirk to the English crown, which they happily did. The door to a Spanish alliance was slammed shut. And that was a door which the French were all too happy to see closed. Paris had always had the better starting position in this particular game. Charles was firmly within the French orbit before he was even restored to his thrones. His mother, Henrietta Maria, was the aunt of the current King of France, Louis XIV, making Charles his cousin. And get used to Louis XIV. He's going to be around for a while. Not only did Charles have this familial tie, but he'd spent a lot of his exile in France, and he really liked French culture and government. The one black mark on Anglo-French relations was Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin was the chief minister of France, a powerful figure in the mould of Cardinal Richelieu, who had made the error of acknowledging Oliver Cromwell in 1654. He then evicted the exiled Stuart court. Now this had seemed like the sensible thing to do at the time, but this naturally left things a little bit cold between Paris and Restoration London, until Mazarin did the convenient thing and died. Apocryphally, he is supposed to have asked his doctor how long he had left to live, and when he told him 2 months, he replied, "That's enough." Once the cardinal was dead, relations between England and France quickly improved, as the young King Louis took full control of his state. The Dowager Queen, Henrietta Maria, successfully arranged the marriage of her daughter, Henriette Anne, to the Duc d'Orléans, Louis's younger brother. Because it's not just the Habsburgs who are fine with cousin marriage. It was this tightening bond between the royal families of Stuart and Bourbon that led to Charles's marriage. But not to a French princess, but a Portuguese one, Catherine of Braganza. This offer began with the Portuguese, who saw in the Stuart kingdoms an invaluable ally in their ongoing war of independence against Spain. Spain, of course, railed against it, but as we've seen, their opinion wasn't worth much in London these days. The French were all for it. In their peace with Spain, they had had to end their support of the Portuguese, but by encouraging a renewed alliance between England and Portugal, they could help Portugal in their war with Spain, while also worsening relations between Spain and England. It was a win-win. Catherine brought as her dowry free trade for English merchants in the Portuguese colonies, the city of Tangiers, the 7 islands of Bombay, and 2 million Portuguese crowns, equaling between £350,000 and £500,000. Such is the foundation of love and marriage between royalty. In return, the Stuart kingdoms would give Portugal military assistance against Spain, and Catherine would have the right to practice her Catholic faith in a private chapel in whichever palace she was in, along with a stipend of £30,000 a year. After more than a year of negotiations, this deal was announced at the opening of the English Parliament on the 8th of May, 1661. Catherine set sail for England the following year, in April 1662, arriving in Portsmouth in May. Charles rode to meet her, and a week later they were married, first in a secret Catholic ceremony, and then a public Anglican one. Historians can be quite blunt about Catherine. Alison Plowden describes her dowry as, quote, "the new queen's principal attraction, for she was a plain, shy little creature, quite unequipped to compete with the rapacious flock of mistresses surrounding the king." End quote. Contemporaries give us this impression. The English ambassador to Lisbon wondered if she'd left the royal palace more than 10 times her entire life. Her royal husband was even more blunt, writing after his wedding that Catherine's, quote, "face is not so exact as to be called a beauty, though her eyes are excellent good, and not anything in her face that in the least degree can shock one." What a charmer. Catherine will struggle in England, and her situation was not helped by the feeling that England had been shortchanged. For starters, quite literally, the dowry of 2 million crowns will never be anywhere near fully paid by the Portuguese. Only half of it came with Catherine, and mostly in sugar and bills of exchange. Both Tangiers and Bombay will also cost far more to maintain than they will bring in. But also, in a very personal and likely quite awful way, the marriage will not lead to any children. It will have been drilled into Catherine throughout her life that her responsibility as a royal princess was to provide heirs. It's not particularly fair, but that was early modern society. Considering that Charles was clearly very fertile, contemporaries and historians lay the blame for this on Catherine. It must have been devastating for her. One biographer puts this down to dysfunctional uterine bleeding. She tried many different remedies, including extended visits to the healing baths of Tunbridge Wells and Bath, but nothing improved her situation. By October 1663, and more than a year of married life, the stress will become so much she will fall sick, and deliriously ask after 3 children she was convinced she'd already had. We will see much more of Catherine in future episodes, as she battles with her husband's mistresses for his attention and makes her own mark on the Restoration Court. But besides Catherine's personal struggles, what interests us is the territory ceded to England in her dowry, Tangiers and the 7 islands of Bombay. We'll start with Tangiers. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't realise that Tangiers, or Tangiers, on the African side of the Straits of Gibraltar, had ever been part of England's orbit, until fairly recently. And at the risk of jumping ahead, it will not remain part of that orbit for very long. But for the 2 decades that England controls it, the port city will be one of London's most expensive commitments. Upon signing the marriage contract in 1661, Tangiers was ceded to the English crown, and on the 29th of January 1662, the new governor arrived to take command. The Earl of Peterborough was Captain General, and he came with around 1,000 infantry, mostly drawn from disbanded regiments of the new model army. Soon, they were joined by 2,000 more men who came from Dunkirk, as the English government desperately tried to juggle 2 expensive outposts. In October 1662, Charles will sell the port of Dunkirk to the French for 5 million livres, or around £300,000. This will not go down well with the merchants of London. At first glance, acquiring Tangiers was an excellent opportunity. Sitting on the northwest corner of Africa and on the entrance to the Straits of Gibraltar, the port could offer a vital stopping point for trade. Ships sailing from England and the Mediterranean and to the markets of Africa and Asia would surely benefit from a friendly port to resupply and shelter. It also offered the Royal Navy a strategic harbour to harass Barbary pirates who still ply the English Channel and Irish Sea for slaves, as well as a good port for conflicts with Spain. The climate was temperate, and the land around the walls was fertile. So that's all the positives. Tangiers' geography is also on the negative side of the page. The climate was normally temperate, but Atlantic storms blew in regularly. The port was geographically well placed, but the harbour itself was tiny. It worked fine for galleys sailing up and down the coast or taking the short crossing to Iberia, but it was far too shallow to accommodate the big ocean-going ships of the Royal Navy or the merchant marine. One of the first priorities of the English would be building a new breakwater to expand the harbour and allow the colony to welcome those massive vessels. This was still being constructed 20 years later when the English evacuated. And it was a colony. Shortly after the English arrived, most of the Portuguese population chose to return to Portugal or to its other African possessions. Despite the personal Catholicism of the new governor, the Earl of Peterborough, the English were still heretics and king-killers, and they didn't want to be ruled by them. This left the city largely empty, and so new arrivals were desperately sought. They were mostly merchant or military families, there for a job but not to set down roots. The English therefore took over a city which was not profitable, and which did not do its intended job particularly well. But if it had time and space, perhaps Tangiers would become a stronghold of English influence at a key crossroads of trade. Which brings us to local politics, which will not give Tangiers time and space. Portugal and Spain were just across the strait, and they also had garrisons and outposts along the Moroccan coast. Their war was still ongoing, and they not only fought each other, but sought allies among the Moroccans and Berbers of the interior, They were not the only European powers in the region. Both France and the Dutch had interests in Morocco. The French needed to be able to send their Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets from one side of Iberia to the other, and keeping the locals friendly was part of that. The Dutch likewise wanted to maintain their trade with the Mediterranean. And of course, the local powers had their own interests. The Kingdom of Morocco was far from united, and the ruling dynasty, the Alawite dynasty, was in conflict with both Berber tribes as well as itself. From 1664, the brother of the Sultan, Moulay al-Rashid, will kill his brother and take the throne, and then spend the rest of his life conquering cities like Marrakesh and Fez. The Alawid Sultanate will be far from centralized in this period, but it will remain a threat to English control of Tangiers, which will require an expensive garrison. Unlike Tangier, Bombay is certainly not a historical footnote in England's imperial history. The archipelago of Bombay was, as the term suggests, a cluster of islands off the western coast of India. There were 7 major islands and many smaller ones, and these would one day, through natural growth and deliberate reclamation efforts, fuse into the modern city of Mumbai. Just south of the Mughal trade hub at Surat, the Portuguese had conquered the islands in the 16th century. Now, along with Tangiers, they were ceded to England. Contemporaries were not particularly enthusiastic. The Earl of Clarendon, Edward Hyde, didn't even know where they were. He thought Bombay was somewhere near Brazil. Samuel Pepys spoke for many when he recorded how he felt that of the two, Tangiers was clearly the better territory to hold. Who needed a few sandbars in Asia when all the wealth of the Mediterranean flowed past Tangiers? Also like Tangier, a royal governor and a garrison were sent to take control of the king's new property. Abraham Shipman was sent with the instructions to govern according to the same customs as other English colonies. But unlike Tangier, which the king and his council would cling on to for dear life, they were desperate to ditch Bombay as quickly as they could find a buyer. And they found one, just down the road from Whitehall, the East India Company. The East India Company had greeted the transfer of Bombay to the king with mixed feelings. Removing the islands from the control of their commercial rival, Portugal, was clearly a good thing. But in taking over the islands, Charles was, sort of, in a way, violating their charter. You see, the East India Company had complete authority over all English subjects east of the Cape of Good Hope. But Charles was governing Bombay as a crown colony. This opened up a whole load of questions for the legalistic English. If a ship was bound for Bombay, but stopped to trade at company ports on the way, was it violating their monopoly? What about pirates and interlopers, merchants who were deliberately flouting company authority? Would they be arrested if they docked in Bombay? That's what the law said. Also, what was the king going to do with Bombay? Bombay was a headache for the crown, something they didn't understand and most of the Privy Council didn't value. The cash-strapped government had already sold Dunkirk, which had been far more valuable for England's position. They had little idea of how to use Bombay. As a strategic position, what could it offer a European kingdom? With that framing and without the benefit of hindsight, we can understand their position. But the East India Company saw potential. So, in December 1667, the Attorney General drafted a charter to grant the East India Company, quote, full power to govern, order, and direct in the said island, as is usual in any other His Majesty's plantations. In 1668, more legal documents officially transferred proprietorship of Bombay from the king to the company. This brought with it the command of the fort, the English garrison, and its population of around 12,000 people. As a sign of how desperately the king wanted to rid himself of the hassle of governing such a faraway and complicated possession, all he got in return was a nominal payment of £10 a year. The company was ecstatic. Its presidency headquarters had been based in Surat for decades, since the first ambassador to the Mughal court had won that concession. And this had been fine, functional. It worked. But Surat was a bustling metropolis outside of European control. The company factors had to be very conscious of local politics, and that had recently been complicated by a succession war, even as Shah Jahan, the current emperor, was still alive. 4 of his sons fought for the throne, and Aurangzeb emerged victorious, personally ordering the execution of 2 of them. He also had his father deposed and imprisoned under house arrest for the rest of his life. Aurangzeb would rule the Mughal Empire into the next century, and lead it to its greatest size. One of these conquests will be against the Marathas under Shivaji, and Surat was dangerously close to the fighting. There were many within the company who thought that the islands of Bombay were a perfect replacement for Surat. It was close to existing trading hubs, like Surat, but isolated from the dangers of the mainland. It would prove to be a highly profitable acquisition, but it also posed the biggest challenge to the company's expectations. They were first and foremost a merchant company, focused on trade. But the wording of their charter will push for the creation of an English colony, like any in America, populated by English colonists and their descendants. But instead, they will find a far more diverse population already in place, made up of Hindus, Muslims, and Catholics from all across the Indian Ocean world. How the company will reckon with a society completely alien to their own will be the topic of many future episodes. Both Tangier and Bombay mark the English Empire's next phase. Despite the hopes of the Privy Council and the merchants of London, Tangier will not become the axle of trade between Africa, Asia, the Mediterranean, and America. It will remain a military outpost, constantly under threat from local and foreign powers, and requiring a large amount of the king's personal revenue to keep afloat. Whereas Bombay, offloaded by the crown as soon as possible, will become the second of the East India Company's great strongholds of their trading empire. Next time, we will continue our survey of the imperial moves of the restored Stuarts, as we turn to a particularly dark chapter in British history, the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Max, Earl of Cameron, and Dave, Earl of Aldridge. They join my existing supporters, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, Xander, Duke of Russell, Stefan Menzikoff, Marquis of Arbroath, and David Metcalfe, Earl of Darlington. If you want to support the show and receive ad-free versions of all of my podcasts, go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Thank you to all of my patrons. This could not happen without you. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.